Sorry for the delay. We are back up and running again. So just give kind of an outline of this talk. I'll first go into some background info about drone technology, photogrammetry, and site scan, and then discuss 2 case studies that we've done using site scan and drone technology. So as probably most of you guys know, I typically speak to non-GIS audiences. So sorry if some of this info is kind of basic, but drone technology has really taken off over the last decade. What used to be kind of a hobby for aviation enthusiasts, you can now find pretty much anybody owning a drone and flying it around. And as we've learned over the last 2 talks, there's a lot of different types of sensors you can attach to drones that make them a very versatile tool for many industries. For this talk, we use the Phantom 4 Pro and the Phantom 4 Pro RTK, and that just has a standard RGB camera attached to it. And when we combine that with photogrammetry, we can get map very large areas. So when we put the drone up, I like figures, and we just take individual photos. Those individual photos can be useful, but it is better if we can actually merge multiple photos into one large orthomosaic image. So what we just went through there was 3 individual photos of a beach. And then using photogrammetry, we can actually stitch those images together using the overlapping areas. And we can make one large orthomosaic image. Okay, and what that looks like, just to give an example, this image was created using around 550 different photos down in Ocean Isle Beach, North Carolina. Okay, now in addition to making an orthomosaic image, we can also get digital elevation models. And the way that happens is as the drone flies around, it actually has a GPS sensor inside of it, and it's recording X, Y, and Z data. That data gets attached to the images, and then when the software is processing the images, we can actually identify the X, Y, and Z coordinates of positions on the ground. And that's through a process called triangulation. And going back down to Ocean Isle Beach, we can clearly see what areas have houses and which areas are the low spots out on the beach. Photogrammetry does not do well with water, and that's why in the bottom of the image, it kind of looks like a crazy mosaic of colors. So going into site scan, how do we collect this data? If you've used Pix4D or Agisoft, the first step is similar to that in site scan, which is we set up our flight plan. So what we can see here is the flight path. So the drone will actually fly along that line, and then we can also adjust our elevation settings or overlap between the images and those type of things, which is what you see over on the left-hand side of the screen. Next is we actually execute the flight plan. So site scan is for iOS devices, but it will actually connect to your drone and then fly it automatically along the flight plan that you've created. So these 2 steps are very similar to any other type of photogrammetry processing software. Step 3 is where it gets a little bit different. So for traditional photogrammetry software, you would download the data and process it on your local computer. This is very resource intensive, and it requires very high-end computers. And for very large projects, it's a very long processing time. With site scan, it's actually cloud-based, so you upload all the images to the website, you adjust your processing settings, and then actually the Amazon cloud servers will actually process all the data. So once you hit go, you can actually shut down your computer, wait until you get an email back, and then at that point, you can go in and look at your data. Another thing that's kind of different with site scan is it actually has tools built into the web browser. So once the data has been processed, you can actually analyze it within the web browser itself. So all the data is stored online, and it's designed to be user-friendly for non-GIS professionals. And some of the things that you can do are like reviewing the orthomosaics and DEMs, You have some very basic measuring tools. You can do volume calculations. You can even compare various flights. So if you fly the same flight day after day, you can compare 2 different flights to each other. In some cases, you might want to export the data and bring it into your own workflow. So you can do that. And in addition to that, you can also provide other users with read-only licenses. And you can share this as many times as you want. And it's a way to distribute the data to people who need to view it. And since everything's already hosted on the cloud, it's a very easy way to distribute your data. So that's kind of an overview of SiteScan. Now we'll get into a few case studies. So with the engineering firm that I work at, we do a lot of shoreline monitoring and beach nourishment projects. And as we've kind of seen in the last presentation, monitoring shorelines is really important to local communities. Most, like Carolina Beach, for example, the beach is one of its main economic drivers. So for tourism, recreation, and then also habitat, there's a lot of various animals and plant species that use the coastal shoreline as its habitat. So knowing what is at risk and what vulnerabilities exist on the coastal shoreline is important for local communities to know. And the way that we have traditionally surveyed the land is with a surveyor and typically like an RTK GPS type system. Again, this is a simple diagram, but he'll go up and over the beach, typically starting back where you would normally find the houses, get elevation points up on the dunes, and then out onto the beach itself. And then most people think that's where the beach system stops, but it actually continues offshore where you can't see. So he is not drowning. He is swimming out there with his RTK equipment. And he will eventually, we actually will swim out to up to 12 feet deep of water with our RTK equipment. And we will actually rendezvous with a survey vessel who will then continue bathymetric surveys up to 3,000 feet offshore. Okay. Now with the drone technology we're using, we can't look at what's in the water. We can only look at what's up on the dry sand beach. And so for this case study, we're going to jump up to Currituck County, which is the northernmost coastal community in North Carolina. It's right next to the Virginia border. And we survey 22 miles of coast up there doing that traditional survey. It takes a crew of 6 to 8 people working 12 to 18-hour days, approximately 2 to 3 weeks to do that entire survey. Down in the southern part of Currituck County, there's a 3.5 mile stretch that is owned by HOA, and they hire us to go out and do drone assessments directly before and after storm events. And what we do here is we zoom into Pine Island. We actually split this area up into 5 different zones. So we have 5 different flight plans, and we can survey this 3.5 mile. A 1 and 2 person crew can do survey this area with a drone in about 4 to 6 hours. So a lot less time than the several week time frame doing it with a traditional survey. Okay. And so once we collect the data in SiteScan, we bring it into ArcPro. One of the nice things is with those orthomosaics, we can just simply compare what was, in this case, we have on the top, we have a data set from 2021. And on the bottom, we have a data set from 2022. We can just compare what do the images look like, how have things changed. But with the elevation models that SiteScan derives, we can also create DEMs of difference. So we basically take the DEM or the elevation model from 2022, we subtract that from the 2021 data set, and we can find what areas are eroding and what areas are accreting across each of those 5 zones. Okay, and what that looks like in terms of stats, this is a comparison between 2022 and 2021. And the big thing to note is that overall, they lost around 17,000 cubic yards of material. So in our industry, we use cubic yards as the main unit. Most people don't know what that looks like. So that is 1,000 to 1,500 dump trucks worth of sand were washed out of that dry sand beach. Okay. And the reason that happened was because in May of 2022, there was a nor'easter storm that sat offshore of Currituck County for 5 days. And this is some of the damages that happened to the coastline. And this is why it's important to monitor these shorelines, is to try to identify these vulnerabilities, so then we know what could potentially happen due to storm events as well as long-term erosion patterns. And as you can imagine, trying to climb over those sand dunes is very difficult. So drone technology is making assessing these type of damages a lot easier and a lot more efficient, and a lot less expensive to the clients who need to assess their shoreline. All right. So next, we're going to jump over into a different case study, which is monitoring wetland habitat. And so this is actually up in Virginia. It is the New Mill Creek Wetland Mitigation Bank. So if the NCDOT or a developer wants to build in a wetland, they typically have to offset any wetlands that they destroy by building new wetlands somewhere else. A lot of times they don't want to build those themselves, so they will actually just purchase mitigation credits. And mitigation credits are basically bought from these banks that are built. So this New Mill Creek Wetland Mitigation Bank was constructed in 2018. It contains 10 acres of vegetated tidal wetland that was planted with Spartina alterniflora and Spartina patens. And when they build it, they don't just get to sell all of the mitigation credits immediately. They actually have to hit benchmarks every single year showing that the vegetation is growing. And as they hit those benchmarks, they can sell more of their credits to developers or whoever's building in the wetlands. And what those benchmarks look like, it's based on the percent vegetation coverage. So percent vegetation versus percent bare grounds. So as you can see, the first year you have to have 10 to 20% coverage with vegetation. And by the time you get to year 5, you have to have 70 to 80% vegetation coverage. Traditionally, what you do is you take a 1 meter by 1 meter quadrat, you throw it out into the marsh, and then you have biologists go out and they estimate what percentage of coverage of vegetation is within that 1 meter quadrat. So that's some surveying that's being done from last year in October. And it takes a crew of 6 to 8 people a full day to go out and monitor this New Mill Creek Mitigation Bank. All right. And this is just an example. I know it's kind of difficult to see, but they took around 60 to 70 different points. And as the last talk discussed, it is difficult traveling around in these areas. So the question is, can we use a simple RGB camera on a drone to classify vegetation versus bare ground, which will be much more efficient and provide much more spatial coverage than what you're getting just throwing random quadrats into the marsh. So the first thing that we did was we set up our flight plan in-site scan. So for those who have flown drones, we had an altitude of 200 feet and we had a 70% overlap. So earlier I discussed how we have to have overlap with our images. So in this case, as the drone flies, it's collecting photos along these lines, and you can set how close those photos are spaced together. Okay. Once it is flown, this was the result of the orthomosaic, and we broke it up into 5 different sections: sections A, B, C, D, and E. And now the question is, can we use some type of process to classify the vegetation versus the bare ground. And so for those who have worked with spectral data, you know that an RGB camera has the red, green, and blue bands, and plants reflect high amounts of green light, so they have very high green values, and they absorb red and blue light, so those values should be much lower in the RGB for each pixel. We use a green chromatic coordinate index, and so basically this is just a ratio of how much green there is compared to the sum of the green, red, and blue bands. And what it tells you is you get a value from 0 to 1, and values that are closer to 0 indicate that there's a low ratio of green and probably means that it's not a plant. Values that are close to 1 indicates there's a high ratio of green, and it probably is a plant. Okay. And then for each of those sections, we had sections A, B, C, D, and E. We set a threshold value. So basically, any values above that threshold will be considered a plant and is classified as vegetation. Anything below that threshold is considered bare ground. And this is the result for that data set. So the brown is the bare ground, and the green areas are the vegetation that was classified based on that method that I just showed you. And then we have results for broken down. In general, across the entire area, we had around 43% of it was vegetated, and 56% or 57% was considered bare ground. And when we compare that, this is just a comparison between the drone and the quadrat. We see it's fairly accurate for section A. In section B, we see that the quadrat had a lot less percent coverage estimate compared to the drone. The way this report was written, for some reason, the quadrat didn't provide data for C, D, and E, but it actually combined it all as the border sections, and we see that it's within about 1% for that as well. And overall, the drone had about 1% more vegetation coverage compared to the quadrat. We also did this similar type of analysis in 2020, and we got similar results. So the drone this is a very rudimentary way to collect data and try to do a spectral analysis compared to getting LiDAR data and using multispectral imagery to analyze it. So with that, I will talk about some of the pros and cons about the side scan technology. First, it's really developed for people who are not necessarily involved a lot with GIS technology, so it's very easy to learn and use. You don't really need high-end computers to run the software because it's all cloud-based. As of now, there's no limits on how much data storage you can use. There's also no limits on how many data processes you can do. So for that Pine Island example, we collected it across 5 different zones. I can actually run all 5 of those zones at the same time, which you would not be able to do on Pix4D or Agisoft. It has built-in data analysis tools, and it's very good for distributing the data to clients and other people who need to view it because it's all cloud-based and you can give them a read-only access. And then finally, it does have since it is being processed on the Amazon cloud servers, it has a very fast processing time. Probably the biggest issue is that it is very expensive. It's $5,500 a year, and that's just for the software. You also have to buy a drone. So I think a Phantom 4 Pro is, I don't really know if they make them that much anymore, but there was like $2,000 to $5,000. Compared to Pix4D and other photogrammetry software, you are limited in the settings you can choose. So it's kind of like a black box. You only have a few check boxes that you can pick, and then it kind of goes off to the Amazon cloud servers. And then finally, this software is really developed for the mining industry. The mining industry, if they're digging out a lot of soil or materials they want to fly before and after to and quantify how much volume was excavated from a mine. So it's not really oriented towards, in this case, the coastal environment. And so with that, thank you for your time. Yeah, so the question was for the Pine Island example, we fly before and after a storm, and we can really only get the dry sand beach. And they were wondering if we ever coordinate with the boat teams to try to collect data as well. The issue with that is getting a boat on site. Typically, you only know a storm's coming, a few days in advance. So getting a boat team on site and then being able to collect that is almost impossible. With that being said, there are autonomous vehicles being built. So Marine Tactical, which is they build autonomous vehicles. They actually have some very small vessels that you can launch by hand. They're anywhere between 6 to 12 feet long. We're hoping that as that technology improves, we can actually take one of those autonomous vehicles with us, launch it directly from the beach, and then while the drone is flying, we can also collect the bathymetry data to try to get both data sets. So. All right.
Great.